This week on Oasis by the Sea, Pastor Keith teaches of Mikvah and Mishnah from the book of John, chapter 5, verses 1 through 18.
That was about a third of the room, which is awesome. I love it when the church is full of kids. Love it when the church is full of kids. And there they go. If you're looking at those words and you're thinking they don't look like English, you're correct. Those are not English words, and we're going to have a little bit of bilingual work this morning. Those are Jewish words. They're Jewish words that are going to be important to understanding part of what's happening today. I promise I'm not going to get too deep into all of it, but I'm going to explain these two words before we even get started. That first word, mikvah. Nope, one back. There we go, mikvah. Mikvah is a word I introduced maybe about a month ago. It's a ceremonial Jewish bath. It was used for several things. For a male, you had to go to the mikvah and get cleansed before you could go to the temple. Also, to this day, you would use a mikvah to get dunked before you could become a Jew. So a lot of Christians might think that the whole getting wet before you can join the group thing is a Christian thing. It originated before us. It started with the Jews, not us, and they would do that in a mikvah. It might be interesting to note, though, that the word mikvah, when it shows up in the Old Testament, there's no ceremony prescribed by God in, say, Leviticus or Deuteronomy to use one. The only time the word shows up in the Old Testament is kind of just as a description of a place dug out by human beings and maybe lined with stones where water would be poured in where you could take a bath. But it wasn't ceremonial yet. But somewhere along the line, the Jews added this ceremony of a mikvah. So that's what a mikvah is. And there's going to be a mikvah in today's passage. And then the second word sounds very similar, Mishnah. A Mishnah is another book. It's a book that we do not have in our Bible. It's a book of the rulings of religious leaders about the law. So if you know the word Torah is from the Jewish law that we do have in the Bible. But over time, as there had been disputes, like any legal system, there'd been a dispute and an argument, and some judge or leader had made a ruling, and then those rulings were recorded, and that became precedent, and then that became how the rules were interpreted in the future. The Mishnah recorded those rulings and extra rules. Jewish law all by itself in the Bible has 613 laws. The Mishnah adds over 1,500. And it's hard for us to imagine, as people who don't live in a system like that, what it was like to live as a Jewish person in the time of Jesus. It was very hard for us to get our head around what that was like, the pressure, the intensity, and this very small nature of how this works. I'm going to give you an example of the Mishnah. In Exodus 34:21, it says, "You shall work for 6 days, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even in plowing time and in harvest you shall rest." So it prohibits plowing. In the Mishnah it reads, "Do not spit on the ground on the Sabbath, or you might move the dirt, and that would be plowing." I'm not making this stuff up. This is how detailed they had gotten to the point of follow the rules. The Jewish mindset wasn't about trying to figure out what the law said about the heart of God. It wasn't about digging out some kind of principle that we could live by. It was, what did the rules say, and to what extent will we go to make sure we do not break the rule? That's the mindset. That's the mindset. Here's some other ones that aren't up there. You could not swat a fly on the Sabbath. By the way, Sabbath, just so you know, Sabbath is a day of rest. Usually we mean the seventh day of the week as a Sabbath, and the Jews weren't allowed to work on the Sabbath. Also, any feast day like Passover or the Feast of Booths, that would be a Sabbath as well. It would have all the same rules as the seventh day Sabbath. Some other things you couldn't do, like I said, you cannot swat a fly on the Sabbath because that would be hunting. And a woman was not to look into a mirror on the Sabbath. Why? because she might see a gray hair and then feel compelled to pluck it. And plucking the hair would be work. Now, this is the world that Jesus was born into. This is the law. This is the system. This is his culture, where it has gone. It's where his culture has taken God's law and what his culture has done with it. Here's another interesting example of what they've done with the law. We're going to read from Deuteronomy 11, 18 to 19. Fix these words of mine in your hearts and minds. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Teach them to your children, talking about them when you sit at home, and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up. And when I read this very symbolically, that God wants his law to be part of our life, part of what we're thinking about, part of every decision we make. That God's message in the Bible is supposed to permeate everything we do. I think of it that way. Here's what the Jews think of it. Next slide. This is an actual picture of what a legalistic Jew today would do. See the box on that head? That's got part of the law in it. See the wrapping on the arm? See that this is a literal interpretation. To this day, there are Jews that during prayer time, all the males will put this on their head and wrap that on their arm so that they can, by the letter, do exactly what it says. It's an attitude. It's a way of looking at things. It's a perspective about the law and how important it is to follow it exactingly. And I'm talking about this because in this passage, Jesus is going to challenge the Mishnah at a mikvah. He's going to challenge the Mishnah at a mikvah. And that's part of what's going on today. He's going to challenge the additional laws that the Jews had added at a ceremonial pool the Jews had invented. So, some other things we're going to look at today. Today we're also going to look at the third miracle of Jesus recorded in the book of John. It's not the third he did in his career. It's the third one that John recorded. John only recorded 7 miracles of Jesus, which is by far the smallest amount of any gospel. And he was very particular about which miracles he picked, and he used them in a multitude of ways. And this is going to be certainly true of this one. This miracle is going to not only demonstrate the character of Christ, it's going to open up a massive discussion that will take us several weeks to unpack as we get more into that part. The first miracle of Jesus honored his mother. That's recorded in John. The second miracle of John in John's book, Jesus loved his enemy. And in the third, he's going to declare war on heartless tradition. He's going to declare war on heartless tradition. Let's start out with chapter 5, verse 1. After these things, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. We're going to just stop with verse 1 for a second. We're going to stay there. After these things, last week we talked about Jesus. He had left Samaria, and he'd gone north, and he'd gone up through his own town. He'd gone up through Nazareth. He'd ended up in Cana, where he had done his first miracle. He met a royal official, and we got that story. So after these things, could mean a week, it could be a month. We don't know how long. Some time passes. There's 7 different Jewish religious feasts per year. John doesn't indicate which one, and there are several it could be, and I think if it mattered, he would have said so I don't think it matters which one. But Jesus has traveled to Jerusalem for one of these feasts, and that's what we got first. Today is the Sabbath, one way or the other. It would be a Sabbath either because it was the 7th day, or it would be the Sabbath because it's a feast. Verse 2, now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called Bethesda, having 5 porticos. So let's do a couple things. First of all, you may not know what a portico is. What is a portico? Well, a portico is simply, if you've seen Roman architecture ever, it's these long pillars with a little hat on top. There's no walls. It's just a little roof on top of these long pillars. You can have a portico on the front of a building, so you can have a whole big building with a long portico. It'd be like a porch or a veranda. So they can either be like a veranda on the front of a building or it can be standalone. So this had 5 separate little alcoves, all that had these little pillars and a little hat on top. And it had 5 of those around the pool. The pool was not at the temple. It was by the gate. We happen to know where the pool is. I think there's a picture. This is the pool of Bethesda. It is nothing like any of the pictures I saw when I was a little kid. I went to Sunday school my whole life, and they would have pictures of this. The pictures in my Sunday school was always like this open area with this round pool in the middle, and a bunch of people sitting around. This is nothing like that. Notice that it's very difficult to enter. There's only one specific entrance. The porticos would have been these different covered areas within that square. If you go to the next slide, this is a current mikvah. You can see the uneven, shallow steps going into the water, and this is what would have been at the heart of that last picture. So at the heart of that other structure that you just saw would have been this bath that went down even further. It would have been rectangular and closed off. You'd have one stairway going down into this water. It was not accessible from multiple sides. It was only accessible from one spot. If we go back to the previous slide again, there's only so many people that are going to fit in this space. Also notice that you would not accidentally end up in the middle of this. You would have to purposefully find the entrance and walk your way down. You would not wander into the heart of this bath. It's far more difficult to get into than that. And we know it's a mikvah because of how it was constructed and so forth. And we know it was by the sheep gate because we know where that is. And so the 5 porticos, the fact that it's the pool by the sheep gate, gives us pretty good confidence that this is the spot. So here's where we are. Let's look at John 5, 3, and 4. In these porticos lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, lame, and withered. I want to stop there. I want you to imagine that little space, 5 little covered areas, and then I want you to add the word multitudes to that spot. I want you to imagine people nearly lying on top of each other. I want you to imagine it is packed with sick people. It is crowded and hard to move through. Just put multitudes in that last spot, waiting for the movings of the waters. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred up the water. Whoever then first, after stirring up of the water, stepped in was made well from whatever disease with which he was afflicted. This pool is not self-fed. In other words, there was no spring underneath of it. Water was run to this pool from a canal. It was man-fed, and then it had a drain, which kept it from getting, disgusting. So the way the water kept running was human beings ran water into it and let water out. The fact that this isolated water in a stone box could get stirred is bizarre. They didn't have jacuzzis. There's no way to pump bubbles into this thing. It's not attached to an exterior water source that could suddenly pump new water in. The whole idea that this box of water would suddenly get agitated is weird. It is not very explainable. It'd be like having a bathtub in your house full of water. You walk in and all of a sudden the water started moving by itself. And you'd go, okay, that's bizarre. That's the level of bizarre that this water would move because there's no spring. It's weird that this would move. It's not explainable that this should move. Additionally, it would be pretty easy to verify whether this claim was true or false, right? I mean, you got a whole crowd of sick people around the pool. If every time it stirred, the first person who came out just as sick as they were before, they'd all go, oh, they'd be out. Like there'd be no one left at the pool anymore. They wouldn't sing around there. The fact that there's a ton of people waiting around the pool verifies that something's working. I don't understand why it's working. I can't explain to you the theology of why it's working. I don't know any of those things. All I know is there'd be no reason to stick around if it wasn't working. And it would be really, really easy to tell whether it was working or not. Pretty hard to fake this. So we've got this boxy area submerged down, crowded with people, these 5 little covers where they're all kind of cramped under for some shade, this little boxy area with some water in it, so occasionally gets stirred. Let's move on to verses 5 and 6. And a certain man was there who had been 38 years in his sickness. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time in that condition, he said to him, "Do you wish to get well?" Thank you. Because that's what I did. Like, I laughed. Isn't this the most ludicrous question ever? That's almost insulting depending on how you look at it. I mean, if you had muscular dystrophy and I met you at a clinic where people were waiting for a doctor, they were waiting for a solution, and I sat down next to you and I go, "Do you wish to get well?" You'd probably hit me. Like, what do you think I'm doing here? What? No. I just like watching everyone else, sitting in a crowded spot with a bunch of other sick people. No, of course I want to get well. This is the strangest scene. Jesus purposely walks down into this sheltered pool, stepping over and around multitudes of the ill. That's what verse 3 said, right? A multitude. So Jesus is stepping over and around and through the sick and helpless until he's next to this one guy. And then he asks this guy and only this guy, "Do you want to get well?" And like I said, wouldn't the answer be something like, "Duh, why else would I be here?" What else but hope would keep this man here? Let me put it that way. It's not a great place to beg. A good place to beg is when you're on a thoroughfare where lots of people go back and forth. You beg at a bridge or at the entrance of the temple, someplace where lots of people have to go in and out, right? Okay, you've got this pool that you have to go into very specifically, and because of what the pool does, it's just full of a bunch of sick people. Who goes down there for fun? Who just walks down into a pool? It's not a good place to beg because no one's going to go there. They're going to go around the pool. He's not there to try to get someone to give him alms. He is there because he has a hope that this water is going to heal him. That's what he's there to do. And yet that hope surely has been tested over and over. Let's look at verse 7. The sick man answered him and said, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me." Whatever this man's ailment is, it makes him move slowly. Perhaps his legs are withered, and he has to drag himself, or maybe it's something else. I do not know. It doesn't specify. Here's what we do know. He's been trying. He's watched other people get healed. If he didn't think that was true, he wouldn't still be here, still trying. And he can't get there in time. And you know what else? No one's taking turns. No one goes, "Hey, buddy, you've been sick for 38 years. Maybe it's your turn. You know what? This time, all the rest of us just wait and let you have your shot." Nobody's doing that. How abandoned and alone is this man's life? I'm not sure sickness is his worst problem. You know, there's another story about a paralyzed man in the Bible about Jesus, and you know what his friends do? His friends climb to the top of the building where Jesus is teaching, cut a hole in the roof, and lower the dude down so that Jesus can see him. That guy had friends. You know what? Maybe that guy, even if he hadn't have been healed of paralysis, had a pretty awesome gift because he had some amazing friends. This dude has got nobody. So Jesus has climbed down the stairs to this pool, made his way over, around and through a multitude of sick people and asked this guy if he wants to get well, and he's heard the answer. And I'm going to tell you, here's the paraphrase of the answer. "I keep trying, but I am never good enough." That's his answer. I'm not fast enough. I'm not strong enough. I'm not popular enough. I keep trying, and I can't get there. That's his answer. I'm not good enough. Other people are good enough to get healed, but never me. Can't you feel the pain? The pain of he's caught in this place where hope is so close, and yet he's never good enough to get to it. He just keeps failing over and over again. I can't do it. What an answer. And here's what Jesus says in verse 8 and 9. Here we go. Jesus said to him, "Arise, take up your pallet and walk." And immediately the man became well, took up his pallet and began to walk. Now it was the Sabbath on that day. I want to just point out that Jesus didn't touch him. In fact, I want to point out Jesus never even proclaimed the man healed. He didn't say, "I'm going to heal you now." He didn't bind anything. He didn't blow on him. He didn't rub a salve on. He spoke some words. Said, "Get up." This is the extent of Jesus' actions here. Second point. If you couldn't spit on the dirt in the Sabbath because it might be plowing, guess what you also could not do? Carry furniture. Yes, this thin, tiny mat that the man had to sleep on that just separated him from the ground was going to be considered furniture. You can't carry furniture on the Sabbath. And you can't heal someone either. Now, if Jesus had not told him to pick up the pallet, there would have been no problem. Jesus could have just said, "Get up and walk." Everything would have been fine. No one would have known. It would have been a secret miracle. But no. Jesus says, "Pick up that filthy thing that you've been laying on that you probably want to burn now and carry it with you." He is not doing this on accident. He's not accidentally walked down into this pool. He has not accidentally walked up to this guy. He has not accidentally done it on the Sabbath. And he has not accidentally told him to pick up his pallet and go. He hasn't accidentally done any of this. None of this scenario is random. Jesus is doing something on purpose here. He orders the man to break the Mishnah. And he is well aware what the Mishnah says. And he is well aware he just told the man to break it. I just want to make that clear. He said, "Break the Mishnah right now." And he does. And you know what's going to happen next, right? Like you can imagine this. You don't even need to read next. You're like, "Oh, I know what's going to happen next." Let's read verses 10 and 11. Therefore the Jews were saying to him who was cured, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not permissible for you to carry your pallet." But he answered them and said, "He who made me well was the one who said to me, 'Take up your pallet and walk.'" You know what's the most disturbing thing for me? Surely this man who had been ill for 38 stupid years was well known for being whatever he had. And they are more concerned that he's carrying a thin piece of blanket than they are that he's well. It's despicable. 38 years of sickness, cured in a moment, and what do they have to say? "Hey, buddy, put that darn thing down. Who do you think you are?" That you would break the Mishnah. How is it that religious people can care more about rules than we do about people being restored? I'm a religious person, and I know I'm talking to myself, but religiosity and self-righteousness does not take us to a good place. Why do the religious care more about rules than they do about people? The answer is always self-righteousness, a feeling that we have met the standards, so we have the right to judge other people for not meeting the standards. Pride, superiority, a complete lack of compassion leads to judgment. And as we heap the rules onto ourselves, we just feel more and more superior for the ones we managed to keep. I am the Holy One before I keep all these rules, and you are scum because you can't or don't. And it is despicable and wrong. God's instructions were never meant for us to feel superior. They were meant to improve our lives. The rules of the Sabbath were a gift to the people of rest, much needed rest that leads to health, mental health, spiritual health, physical health. God ordained this Sabbath pattern to force them to slow down and rest because he knew it was best for them. And he's taken this gift, they've taken this gift and they've turned it into a burden. They've turned it into this massive weight that they must struggle under. It's completely contrary to the entire point. This gift has been turned into a curse that would make this man feel guilty for the very health the Sabbath was designed to protect. Let me tell you that Jesus, the author of the gift of the Sabbath, knew what his people had done to this gift, and he wasn't just going to let this go. This is a showdown, one that Jesus doesn't intend to miss. Let's read verses 12 through 16. They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your pallet and walk'?" But he who was healed did not know who it was. For Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. There was always a crowd in that place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "Behold, you have become well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse may befall you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well, and for this reason the Jews were persecuted Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. There is so much detail crammed here, so many truths. I think the first thing that we ought to recognize is the importance that this guy had no idea who Jesus was. He was healed, and he had no idea how, why, or who did it, nothing. It was not because he had a specific faith in the person of Jesus Christ. He didn't know it was Jesus Christ. He didn't know. I'd like to just point out that Jesus can do what he wants, where he wants, and when he wants, for the reason he wants and who he wants, as it suits his will and purpose, period. He does not have to do it by anybody else's rules, and there are no standards he has to keep. If he decides he wants to heal somebody, someone gets healed. Done. How many people were gathered at the pool? How many got healed? Why this guy? We don't know for sure. But consider that later, where does Jesus find him? At the temple. Now see, I don't know where you would go if you were suddenly healed of an illness of 38 years, but this guy, he's at the temple. Jesus didn't tell him to go to the temple. Jesus didn't say anything even remotely religious to him in their first meeting. He didn't even mention God in their first meeting. I wonder how long it's been since this man had been to the temple. I mean, if he couldn't make it down the steps to the water, how is he going to make it all the way to the temple and back? And if nobody's willing to carry him to the water, who would have carried him to church? But now that he can move, now that he's healed, where do we find him? Pursuing the presence of God. There was something about this man's character Jesus liked. And he may not have known Jesus yet. That's okay. Jesus really liked what was inside this guy. That he would take that healing and immediately go to worship his God in his temple. That was his instinctive move, was to go thank God at church. And what does Jesus do when he sees him? First of all, Jesus makes sure the man knows who he is so that he can go tell everyone else, because it's just not going to work if nobody knows it was Jesus. Jesus has a planned encounter coming up here, and it's not going to work if nobody knows he didn't do it. He did it, so he's making sure. And he gives him a warning. God has been gracious. God has given you a chance. Do not blow it. Do not throw your chance away. And now that the healed man knows who Jesus is, the word is out. Jesus of Nazareth commanded a person to break the Mishnah. Who does this guy think he is? Now, before I read this next verse, I want us to remember, what must we not do on the Sabbath? The answer is work. Even if with the law, right? Even with the original law of Moses, the Ten Commandments, the whole bit. What we can say for certainty is that what we should not do on the Sabbath is work. All right, let's work. Let's read verse 17, what Jesus is going to say. But this is what Jesus says. My Father is working until now, and I myself am working. That is not a word they wanted to hear on the Sabbath. He says, oh, I'm sorry. I was busy working. Maybe you didn't hear that I was working today. There could not be more in your face than for him to use this exact word, working. What are you doing? I am working on the Sabbath. Come at me, bro. You know? This is a challenge. He could have said anything else. He could have said, oh, come on, I talked to the guy. Since when was talking against the Mishnah? I didn't even say he was healed. I didn't say Shazam or bind his legs in a bandage. I just talked to him. Are you going to call that work? Jesus could have said that. He might have gotten away with it. If Jesus didn't want this to become a scene, he could have talked in a way that would not have made a scene. He does the exact opposite. There's simply nothing that Jesus could have said that would have made it more inflammatory. There isn't a single thing Jesus could have said that would have made it less confronting. It's the Sabbath right now, and here's what Jesus says: my Father continues to work, and so I am working right now. I am working present tense. As you talk to me on the Sabbath today, I am presently working, and here's why. Because even though, as an example, God rested after the seventh day of creation, 6 days, and then he rested one, the reality is he continues to work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The truth is the Father never sleeps and he never stops working, Sabbath included. The Father never quits working, therefore the Son never quits working either. Because I am the one true Son of the Father, therefore I also never quit working. And once again, the Gospel of John makes it ever so clear of what Jesus is claiming. This is verse 18. For this cause, therefore, the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because he not only was breaking the Sabbath, but he was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Look, John says it so clearly there. The people who argue that Jesus never claimed to be God, look, if he didn't want the Jews to think he was God, he would have corrected this error. If the Jews thought he was claiming to be God and he didn't mean for that message, you would go, oh, stop. Guys, I don't mean that I'm equal to God. I didn't mean that. Don't go there. That would be blasphemy. He does not care that that's what the Jews think because it's true. So he doesn't care that they think that he's equal to God, that that's what he's claiming. That's the fact that he is claiming. He is claiming to be equal to God. And there it is, as clearly stated as humanly possible. Jesus made it clear by his words, by his actions, that he was equal with the Father. He did not accidentally do that. He didn't accidentally do any of this. And it leads to an amazing sermon that will start next week. An amazing sermon, the longest passage of what Jesus says so far in the book of John, and Jesus says some amazing, in-your-face, abrupt things in this coming sermon. That's next week. But let's look at some important truths from today that we've already looked at, but let's see if we can't grab them, sort them out, make sure we've got them stuck, and then think about how they might apply to us. Let's look at the first one. In this third miracle of the book of John, Jesus uses a healing to confront a decaying religion. Jesus uses this healing to confront a decaying religion. Jesus was Jewish. And his people had become so calloused, so self-righteous, and so arrogant that they needed this slap in the face to hopefully wake up. The question of, would you really attack this man for not following one of your 1,500 laws when he has been healed after 38 years of suffering? Would you really do that? Are you really that blind to the needs and suffering? And are you that blind to what real love is? He's addressing a blight upon his people. His culture had a disease that was far worse than what this man had that kept him out of the pool. His culture had a disease of heartless rule following. And Jesus is exposing it for exactly the ridiculous level it had reached. I don't know how Jesus would react to today's church, but I wouldn't want an embarrassment like this. On a personal level, our own religion can get sick too. We can start to value our rules and our spiritual greatness more than we value our love for our fellow human beings. And if that happens, we start to move into that same place of disease that Jesus' culture was in. We need to be careful about our legalism, our pride in keeping rules, at looking down at people who do not meet our moral standard. We need to be careful because it's a trap. So maybe that's the first thing, because that's definitely the major thing. That's what Jesus came to expose in this whole thing. He set the whole thing up to expose this disease in his culture. That was the point. That's what he's doing. The second thing we might want to look at, though, is Jesus asks everyone the same question. Do you want to be well? Do you want to be well? There are people in our world struggling with depression. Do they want to be well? Are they in this room? Do they want to be well? How badly do we want to be well? There are people struggling with grief and shame and disappointment and addiction. Do we want to be well? And maybe you're struggling, or they're struggling, or the people in our lives are struggling with the same response that this man had. This man said to Jesus, I'm not good enough. I am not good enough to get well. I am not strong enough to get well. I am not fast enough. I am not popular enough. I don't have enough. I'm sick. My life is broken. There's something badly damaged. I'm having trouble getting up in the morning. I'm not doing okay, and I don't know how to fix it. I wish I was like the few people I see that managed to get out. I don't know how they managed to get out. I wish it was me. But I'm still stuck here, and I'm not okay. You know what hurts me sometimes? I'd carry you if you let me. I'd carry you to that water, but people won't even tell me that they're hurting. They won't tell anybody sometimes. They're just in this spot of sickness, of isolation, of pain, and they won't talk. How badly do we want to get well? It doesn't have to be me. Share it with someone else that you trust. Share it with someone. If you want to get well, I would stand with you. And if not me, someone else. Jesus can heal what was impossible for 38 years to cure in this man. He can heal you too. But maybe that needs to be more than just laying in the pain and wishing something would happen. Maybe there's more that needs to take place for you to get well. There's a lot of sick people. There's a lot of broken people. Jesus asks everybody the same question. Do you want to get well? Let's look at number 3. Slide number 3. Let's be careful not to squander God's grace. That was the warning that Jesus gave the man, right? When he met him in the temple. He says, I've healed you. You got out of the mess. You're walking. You're here in the temple. Don't waste it. How often have people turned to God just long enough to get through their crisis and then walk away again? And when we do that, when we take the gift of God that he gave us of a new chance and a new hope, and we squander it, Jesus said this, not me. Jesus warned this man, not only could it happen again, it could get worse. Worse than it was. Worse than being surrounded by other sick people and failing, always failing at getting better. How often is it that our existence, when we are ignoring God and running from God, that everyone around us is sick too, and we're all failing together, and hope seems like it's just right over there, and yet day after day, most of us stay exactly where we are. Jesus has saved this man from that existence, and he warns him not to go back. How much more bitter would it be knowing you had made it out once, and yet here you were again in this endless hell of never being good enough to get out. When Jesus rescues us, when he pulls us up, when he puts us back together, when he fixes it, when he makes us well, be careful. Don't squander that grace. Why would you want to give up the gift you've been given? Jesus has come to rescue. Do we want to be well? Do we want to stay well? And are we willing to acknowledge that sometimes our real sickness, our illness, can be our religious arrogance that condemns other people? And that we tend to slide into the people judging all the folks that are struggling, or be a person who's constantly struggling and doesn't know how to get out. And yet somewhere in the middle should be a compassionate, healthy person who both is not squandering what God has given them, but hasn't lost their love for the lost and people that are in pain. Somewhere there's a healthy place to live that's in neither one of those ends. Let's pray.
You've been listening to Oasis by the Sea. Thank you so much for joining us today. May God richly bless you until we see you next week at the Oasis.